поутру на заре по росистой траве я пойду свежим утром дышать, и в душистую тень, где теснится сирень, я пойду свое счастье искать. В жизни счастье одно мне найти суждено, и то счастье в сирене живет, на зеленых ветвях, на душистых кистях. Мое бедное счастье цветет.
That's a song by Rachmaninoff about flowers and happiness. In the morning at dawn, I go to the lilac bower where all my joy resides. If you study Rachmaninoff's songs, which are the basis of this performance and a treasure house of beauty, there's plenty of evidence that he could be happy. In nature, in love, in material success, which he had in abundance. He ended up with a very good life. But happiness was not his default mode. There's an image that's passed down to us of Rachmaninoff as a granite-faced character who, when he performed as a pianist or as a conductor, had the platform manner of an undertaker. Famously, Stravinsky described him as a 6'5" scowl, although there was an element of jealousy there because Rachmaninoff was very tall and Stravinsky was very short. But something of that scowl feeds into the music. All the symphonies are in the minor, all the piano concertos. Time and again, the music quotes a dark, plain song melody associated with a Latin requiem. Dies irae, dies illa, the day of wrath that day shall be. Why was Rachmaninoff so miserable? Well, one answer is that he carried with him in his soul a sense of exile as a displaced person. It's tempting to say he cultivated it, but it grew from circumstances over which he had no control. He suffered through his life a series of great losses, and the first loss was his childhood home. Rachmaninoff was born in 1873 in the lower aristocracy. It was a world of servants, country estates, respectful peasants who tugged their forelock. It was a pretty idyllic existence. And you notice how often the songs enshrine the image of the countryside as a kind of paradise. Songs like Before My Window, which talks of a cherry tree flowering in white bridal robes. It calls me, it breathes in sweetness of blossoms, and my senses reel with songs of love.
Цветет радумчиво под ризой серебристой, и веткой свежей и душистой склонилась
The country idyll meant a lot to the young Rachmaninoff, but at the age of 9 he lost it thanks to his father, who was like a character from Russian literature. Russian literature has stock types. One is the superfluous man, an example of which is Eugene Onegin. Rich, pampered, useless, doesn't know how to deal with money, wastes it on drink and gambling. Well, Rachmaninoff's father was a superfluous man. He lost his inheritance, he lost his estates, and the family all end up in a small flat in St. Petersburg where everything falls apart and the father leaves. Thankfully, the wider family move in and they support Rachmaninoff and they encourage him in music, at which he proves untalented but lazy. The solution is at the age of 12 he's sent to a piano teacher in Moscow where the pupils all live in. It's a bit like a musical borstal. It's very strict. And Rachmaninoff ultimately rebelled. But during his years there, he made some very good contacts. He got noticed, and he was noticed in the Moscow Conservatoire, where his studies shifted from piano to composition, and he graduates in 1892 as a star. The same year, he writes an opera, Alyeko, which is taken up by the Bolshoi. And he writes his first piano concerto, and he finds enduring fame with one short piece. That's the C-sharp minor prelude, which became maybe his most popular piece and should have made him rich. To his annoyance, he sold the rights for 40 rubles and earned nothing. But never mind, in 1892 things were going well. He was on a high. But as we all know from the stock market, after the highs come the lows. And in Rachmaninoff's case, they were dramatic. Short operas and piano preludes are all very well, but what mattered at that time was writing a symphony. Rachmaninoff worked long and hard on his Symphony No. 1, and it proved a disaster. The critics, waiting as critics do to shoot down any rising star, showed no mercy. What does Rachmaninoff do then? He sinks into depression and writes nothing except trifles for about 3 years, a barrenness so terrible that he goes to ask the writer Tolstoy what he can do. It's hard to know why Rachmaninoff went to Tolstoy, but it was a bad idea, because Tolstoy was neither musical nor sympathetic. All he did was rub Rachmaninoff's knees in a consoling way, whatever that was about, and tell him that his composition wasn't actually needed by anyone. It's as well that Tolstoy didn't write self-help books, and you can imagine how it left Rachmaninoff feeling. In fact, you don't need to imagine, because here's chapter and verse, a song called Sorrow in Springtime. How painful it is to lie awake on this spring night. If only old age would come and songs no longer poured from my soul, I wouldn't be so sad in silence.
Как мне больно, как хочется жить, как свежа и душиста весна. Нет, не в силах я сердце убить в эту ночь голубую без сна. Хоть бы старость пришла поскорей, хоть бы не в кудрях заблестел, чтобы не пел для меня соловей, чтобы лист для меня не жалел, чтобы весь не рвалась из груди сквозь сирени в широкую даль, чтобы не было в этой тиши мне чего-то мучительно жаль.
Rachmaninoff's sadness seemed incurable, but the writer's block did lift. The story is thanks to a hypnotherapist called Dr. Dahl. Rachmaninoff saw Dr. Dahl every day for 3 months, from January to April 1900, and in truth it had a debatable effect, because in June, Rachmaninoff was still writing to people saying, "I can't compose." But by July, he could, and he produced one of his greatest and most enduring hits. That's the second piano concerto, which Rachmaninoff attributed to the effects of hypnotherapy and dedicated to Dr. Dahl, though the theory is that all his visits to the therapist had an ulterior motive. There was a nice girl in the office, and Rachmaninoff was looking for a wife. Eventually, he found his wife within his own family. She was his cousin Natalia, and between them they developed a great and enduring love. With the marriage, he inherited part of her idyllic family estate, Ivanovka, where they settled. And all this got rhapsodized into song. One in particular called "How Fair This Spot," which was written as an engagement present. It was his special gift to her. Whenever he travelled, he sent Natalia a card inscribed with the 4 notes that start the vocal line of the song. It became a sort of motto for their relationship.
Здесь хорошо, взгляни, вдали огнем горит река, цветным ковром луга легли, белеют облака. Здесь нет людей, здесь тишина, здесь только Бог да я. Цветы да старая сосна, да мечта моя.
The text of that song reads like an estate agent's brochure for Ivanovka. How peaceful it is here, with a shimmering river, carpeted fields, no people, just God, the flowers, me and you. Life there was an idyll, Rachmaninoff composed, he planted willows, he bred horses, he ran farms. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Ivanovka needed an estate agent's brochure, because along came revolution and war. And although Rachmaninoff wasn't politically engaged, he was a landowner. And as a landowner in 1917, you had no choice but to flee. They were frantic, desperate circumstances in the depths of winter. On the pretext of having some concerts in Scandinavia, he got an exit visa for himself and his wife and his 2 children. They took an overnight train to Petrograd, another overnight train to Finland, and then a sledge to Sweden. And they arrived in Stockholm on Christmas Eve. All they had were the clothes they stood up in, a few small bags, 500 rubles each. And Rachmaninoff would never go back to Russia again. He would never see Ivanovka, and it was left to rot by the Bolsheviks. From now on, he was in exile, and it hurt, with an anguish you hear in one of his most celebrated songs. Oh, never sing to me again the songs of Georgia. They remind me of another life, a distant shore, the moonlit face of my lost love. Having left Russia in such a hurry, the question for Rachmaninoff remained, where do I go now? His decision was America. He'd been there before, but he didn't like it. But America liked him. He had offers to conduct, to play the piano. And that was something he was always outstandingly good at, but it had always been secondary to composition. Now the situation was reversed, and composition took a back seat. He played endless concerts in America, over 1,000 in the next 2 decades, plus endless tours back to Europe. He was so often on the move, he had his own railway carriage with an upright piano. And as you can tell from that, he became successful and rich. You'd look at him and you'd think, this is a man who's flourishing, who's made a fresh start, of the kind envisaged in a song, Spring Waters, that depicts the classic Russian image of the ice break, when winter gives way to spring and there's a sudden exhilarating surge of energy. As the song has it, the fields are covered with snow, but the streams are awake and shouting, spring is here. We are her messengers.
Еще в полях белеет снег, воды уж весной шумят. Бегут и будет сонный брег, бегут и блещут и голосят. Они голосят во все концы. Теплых майских дней румяный светлый хоровод толпится весело за
But however well Rachmaninoff seemed to be doing in America, the endless tours also meant that he never settled. In truth, he felt lost. The only way to deal with it was to create a little Russia around himself. He had various homes, and they were all Russian-type dwellings with Russian servants and Russian foods and Russian ways of life. He never took American citizenship until the end of his own life. And as somebody said, he maintained the pretext of being a loyal subject of a non-existent Tsar, always looking back. As the song called A Dream puts it, I had a homeland, a beautiful one, but that was a dream. There were friends, family, words of love, but that too was a dream.
Семья друзей жива была, звучали мне любви слова. Но то был сон.
Though Rachmaninoff never returned to Russia, he did return to composing, but not as before. There were no more songs in America. Everything you've heard in this programme was written before that momentous flight from home in 1917. He was not encouraged by the reception given to the few big pieces after 1917, but he scored one big hit. That's the Paganini Variations, which went down well from the start. But everything else was savaged by the critics and failed to excite audiences. The problem was that his music appeared past its sell-by date. Rachmaninoff had begun around 1890 as a late romantic. 30 to 40 years on, he was still a late romantic. And in a time of modernism, when the exciting figures were people like Stravinsky and Prokofiev, the world had moved on and Rachmaninoff had not. He dealt with all this by retreat. He bought himself a piece of land on Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, and he built himself a house there, ironically a modernist building, to recreate the tranquility of Ivanovka. In many ways, it gave him happiness. The happiness he long pursued. It gave him quality of life, money, speedboats. He loved speedboats. He loved fast cars. It was all pretty good until, you guessed, fate intervened again. And this time it was World War II. He reckoned that if he stayed in Switzerland, he'd be trapped. So he packed up and he went back to America. Got himself a house in Beverley Hills, where so many exiled musicians ended up. His neighbours there included Stravinsky, with whom he had a strained relationship. They would meet and they would talk about royalties, not the crowned heads, but the money. Meanwhile, he kept on playing until his 70th birthday loomed and he decided it would be his last season of touring. In fact, it turned out to be his last season of everything. In the middle of the tour, in Knoxville, Tennessee, he was taken ill and he was ferried back to Los Angeles. It turned out that he'd had rapidly advancing cancer. He died a few days before his 70th birthday on the 17th of February, 1943. So far as Russian audiences were concerned, it was like a second death, which they were quite surprised to hear about. The Soviets had banned his music effectively, and they'd spread the rumour that he'd passed away years before. But the memory of Rachmaninoff had never died. He was popular as a relic of the old days. Outside Russia, being a relic of the old days was not so welcome. Although it was popular, Rachmaninoff's music was not taken seriously. It was thought to be self-indulgent, gushing, overwritten, and worst of all, conservative. It's only relatively recently that there's been enough distance in time to be able to judge Rachmaninoff without reference to whether he is or isn't of the moment, to simply be able to surrender to the beauty of it. Curiously, when Rachmaninoff died, he wasn't buried in Los Angeles. They took his body to New York State, to the churchyard of a small town called Valhalla. And there he remains. In 2015, the Russian authorities tried to get his body back. The family refused. They decided that, as he'd been in exile in life, So he would stay an exile in death.